The danger with evaluation is that we then focus on what we can measure, and we start to talk about what we can measure as being what the program is intended to achieve, rather than keeping in mind that it's the outcomes that we're interested in, and the measures are just at best an indirect representation of those outcomes or a partial subset of those outcomes.
Looking at information that doesn't necessarily relate directly to the outcomes that we're trying to measure, we might come across pieces of information that are intrinsically very interesting, particularly when we're researchers. But to channel our energies into analysing those when they don't tell us about the outcome that we're trying to achieve is really an unethical use of our time and our resources. It can also confound some of the findings if we don't be very careful to make sure that everything that we speak to is actually part of the story between cause and effect. Now, that establishment of cause and effect can be very challenging because nothing that we do in the social change area works in isolation. And particularly in the case of the domestic and family violence reform strategy, there are a multitude of different programs and initiatives running at the same time. And so it becomes quite challenging to disentangle the effects of one program from what might be seen in the arena of another. So we need to make sure that as we are choosing our information, our indicators of success and change, that we can tie those directly back to the actions that are part of our initiative, and then we can tie them forward to the change that we need to see.
The interpretation of the findings from an evaluation is critical for generating knowledge that can help us drive policy reform, policy innovation, and indeed ensure that the policies that are working well are continued to be funded. There are two questions that we need to think about when interpreting the findings. One, are we interpreting the findings in a way that accurately reflects what the data says, or are we interpreting the findings through a lens that supports what the funder or the program or the department wants? We need to always be clear that what we're saying from an evaluation is driven by what the evidence and the data says. Sometimes this will be uncomfortable because it will be contrary to what we think should have happened or what some people would like to happen, but nevertheless we need to stay very, very close to our data. We need to be driven by the evidence, not by what we think the formal intention is. The second area that we need to think about in terms of interpreting the evidence is how representative is the data? How transferable is the knowledge that we've produced in one social program to another social program elsewhere in Queensland? How, for example, is this data relevant from the city in Brisbane to country areas? How relevant is the data from North Queensland to Western Queensland, for example? We need to make sure that when we're designing the evaluation, we have representative samples. We need to make sure before we actually start collecting the data, that the data that we are going to collect in the future will be able to say something outside of the evaluation site. And this is why a very, very careful design with a very, very thoughtful and deliberate recruitment strategy of people, of data sources, enables us to say something that goes beyond the study side of the evaluation.
Another common challenge in interpreting our findings is the temptation to generalise what we're seeing beyond the parameters of where we've collected the information. For example, if we run a pilot program to look at assisting people who are victims of domestic and family violence to improve their safety in an area of urban Brisbane, for example, where there are a large number of services that may be able to support them, the pathways for their care might not necessarily be translatable to an area where there is a much lower service density, or whether there are other geographic or particularly cultural factors that might impact on their interaction with the service environment. That means that our findings from an urban environment such as Brisbane cannot be directly translated to another area like far regional Queensland, where the environment is quite different, either culturally or in the terms of services.
One of the common pitfalls is drawing an incorrect conclusion about whether or not the program has made a difference with respect to the outcomes that we care about. And to give you an example, we might be interested in trying to improve school attendance in a series of schools. And so we introduce a program which has as its aim ensuring that attendance rates go up and rates of unauthorised absences from schools go down. We introduce the program, we collect the data, and we find at the same time as we've introduced the program, the attendance rates have improved. Now, it's tempting under those circumstances to conclude that the program actually made a difference and it improved attendance rates in the way that we wanted it to. But we can't automatically assume that even if we find the data show that, because there could be other things that are going on that we haven't been aware of, which could have also been moving attendance rates in that direction. So one of the things that we know about schools, for instance, is that they're often doing many, many different types of things at the same time. And it could be that at the same time as we've introduced the program to raise attendance, some schools have also had other programs in place which are intended to promote student engagement with learning. And one of the side effects of that is that young people come to school more often and rates of unauthorised absences go down. And that could be the real driver of the increase in attendance. Well-designed evaluations can help you avoid that kind of a problem by taking account of some of the other things that you might not have anticipated in a way that you can draw a causal inference like that.
Another common challenge in interpreting our findings is the temptation to generalise what we're seeing beyond the parameters of where we've collected the information. For example, if we run a pilot program to look at assisting people who are victims of domestic and family violence to improve their safety in an area of urban Brisbane, for example, where there are a large number of services that may be able to support them, the pathways for their care might not necessarily be translatable to an area where there is a much lower service density, or whether there are other geographic or particularly cultural factors that might impact on their interaction with the service environment. That means that our findings from an urban environment such as Brisbane cannot be directly translated to another area like far regional Queensland, where the environment is quite different, either culturally or in the terms of services.
Not everything that matters can be counted, and not everything that can be counted matters, because some of the things that it's easy to count are actually the things that we're not so interested in, and some of the things that it is difficult to measure and count are the things that we're really interested in.